Well, David Nakamura is a White House reporter for the Washington Post. He joins me now. David, this isn't the first time that the president has disputed a conversation that he had that reportedly doesn't put him quite in a favorable light. So what's going on here?
Right. Well, this is really hard to understand why the president would pick another fight here. He didn't comment on these 4 U.S. soldiers that were killed in Niger for 12 days until he was asked 2 days ago in the Rose Garden why he hadn't commented. And then he picked an immediate fight with past presidents, including President Obama, saying that erroneously saying that they had not called the families of deceased soldiers. Now he's fighting with this congresswoman and, in effect, with the family that took this call. And a presidential call, a presidential letter is supposed to be to show empathy and to offer support. The president's not doing that here. He says he has evidence about what he did or didn't say. It almost doesn't even matter. It seems like the family and the congresswoman, believed that this was the tone of the president. They've both said this publicly now, and it sort of recalls during the campaign, if you recall, last year when the president got into, or the candidate Trump got into a spat with another Gold Star family, a Muslim American family whose son had also been killed. And it was this president does not back down. But for someone who tries to talk about how he's a powerful commander in chief who wants and elicits respect from the troops, it doesn't make sense about why he's doing this.
Yeah, you mentioned the second Gold Star family, seeing those images of the wife, crying over his casket. It's heartbreaking to watch. Did we ever learn why the president in the beginning took so long to reach out to the families to begin with? Is that unusual?
Well, in some ways, it's not necessarily unusual. A number of service members have gotten killed, of course, during the Iraq and Afghan wars, and there were a lot of dead and injured soldiers, and it was probably impossible for past presidents to call each of them and reach out individually, if not at least through a letter, but potentially calls individually to each of the families. However, in this case, it was the deadliest day in U.S. combat since President Trump took office. So it was an important marker. And one that the president, you think, would be briefed on and potentially at least have the aides say, look, you should reach out to these families. He didn't do it. Talked about writing letters to the families when he was asked about it in the Rose Garden that he would soon call. And this call does not seem to have gone in any measure to make the family feel better or to probably even to make the country feel better about the sacrifice these soldiers made.
And especially these families, you just can't even imagine what other families are thinking who have their family members serving abroad. I want to turn now, though, to David, to health care. Meanwhile, we're trying to sort of figure out where the president stands on this. Today, he backtracked, it appears, for his support for this bipartisan deal to pay for health care subsidies that he had actually cut last week. I want to play a bite for you.
We're going to see the bipartisan, and Lamar Alexander's working on it very hard from our side. And if something can happen, that's fine. But I won't do anything to enrich the insurance companies, because right now, the insurance companies are being enriched. They've been enriched by Obamacare like nothing anybody's ever seen before. I am not going to do anything to enrich the insurance companies.
So, David, this legislation, it was by Senators Alexander and Murray. It was a sort of a patchwork, a temporary fix after the president announced that he'd stop making these payments that would cause the premiums to spike. So what happens if he changes his mind and he doesn't support this agreement?
Well, premiums are going to spike, and insurers have already factored into their rates next year, and that could continue to undermine and destabilize the markets and lead to a further undermining of the Affordable Care Act. And we know the president and leaders in Congress on the Republican side have sought several times now to try to fully repeal that bill or that law, and it hasn't been successful. And this is President Trump's executive action the other day to strip these CSR subsidies for lower-income residents trying to cover their health care costs has really thrust some more uncertainty into the system. And the president then suggested, okay, it's up to Congress and I'll support them. And Lamar Alexander has come out and said, look, the president has told me in private calls that he does support this effort and that, maybe he'll want to add something. We're going to keep at it. But the problem that they're facing in Congress right now is that the Republican leaders seem to be more focused on the tax reform and other priorities, and it's not just Trump who has seemed to backtrack now in the face of some conservative revolt over this idea from the senators, but that the Republican leadership does not support it as well. So it seems like another high hurdle here for this Alexander and Murray bipartisan effort.
Is that the reason, David? I mean, yesterday it seemed like, at the press conference, he signaled that he was going to be supportive of this measure. Do we know what changed? Was it because other Republicans are coming out saying that they're not in step with this?
It does seem that way. The president spoke last night at the Heritage Foundation, and I think there was some conservative unhappiness with this effort. Republicans have long talked about repealing Obamacare and sort of to prop it up, and even if it was a patchwork deal. As the lawmakers continue to work on this next year, I think that the president ultimately decided that it may not be politically viable for him and his base. But the problem is that some of his base stands to get hurt by this. And in some ways, this is also indicative of the way the president's addressed the fate of these dreamers on immigration, where he's undermined President Obama's effort to allow these dreamers to stay and work, these undocumented immigrants, and suggested he would support Democratic efforts to legalize them, but then came out later with more hardline immigration principles and seemed to swing back to the other side and take a harder-line position, conservative position. So it's not clear whether the president really wants a deal in both cases.
And, yesterday we also heard the president insisting that he's got the votes, he's got the support for long-term health care legislation. Do you believe that's the case?
No, I mean, congressional aides continue to say privately that that's not the case, and that right now their focus is on, as I mentioned, tax reform and a number of other priorities. But Senator Alexander says this is not over, this effort to sort of do this compromise on health care subsidies, and that it could be factored into some of the year-end negotiations, of which now there are a number, including immigration, including tax reform, and including the budget deal that's due in December. So it could be a very busy, next few months.
Yeah, absolutely. Before you go, David, I want to ask you about this second judge today that halted the president's travel ban. This one was in Maryland. The one yesterday was in Hawaii. So this judge has blocked it before. It was supposed to go into effect today. Why has this been such a struggle, this ban for the administration?
What's interesting is this judge made very clear what other judges have in previous stops on the previous attempts at a travel ban, which is that President Trump has been hurt by his own words in which he suggested, and his aides suggested, that the aim was to block Muslim immigrants to the United States. And so this judge is saying that even the revised version, second revision to the original travel ban can be interpreted very clearly as an attempt to hold up a number of Muslim immigrants. And so they said that's general sense that's unconstitutional. Again, these cases continue to be heard in both courts, and these rulings are only temporary injunctions. But it just shows that the president has been hurt by his own sort of bombast. This is probably not the first case, but this is a legal example in which the president's being hurt by his own previous statements.
Yeah, I wonder if the White House will abandon this and move on to other security measures. David Nakamura, thank you so much for joining us, David.
Thanks, Rena.